Before she was born, heaven was already watching, not watching the way history watches, from a distance, with detachment, watching the way a father watches for a child who is coming home, with longing, with preparation, with a kind of love that had been building for longer than any of us can count. The Gospels give us fragments of Mary, a young woman in Nazareth who said yes to an angel, a mother at a manger, a woman beneath a cross, and then almost nothing. The Gospels were not written to be her story. They were written to be her son's. But in the early 19th century, a bedridden Augustinian nun in Germany began to see. Her name was Anne Catherine Emmerich, a mystic, a stigmatic, a woman who bore on her own body the wounds of the crucifixion and who over years of illness and prayer was given visions of extraordinary precision and intimacy, not just the life of Jesus, not just the Passion, but the life of Mary, from long before her birth to long after her death, in detail so specific that it reads not like imagination, but like memory. She described Mary's family, her parents, the prayer of her parents in the darkness before she was conceived, the moment she entered the temple as a 3-year-old child, the veil she wore at her wedding, the exact way she stood at the foot of the cross. What Emmerich saw cannot be verified. The Church does not require you to believe it. But 2 centuries of readers have encountered these visions and found something they did not expect: recognition, as though they already knew this woman, but had never heard her story told out loud. This is that story. It did not begin with Mary. It began much earlier, with a people so quiet, so hidden, so consumed by longing, that the rest of the world had largely forgotten they existed. Emmerich calls them Essenes, a community of devout Israelites who lived in the hills and deserts of the Promised Land, who had been keeping a particular kind of vigil for generations, not for any earthly king, not for political deliverance. They were waiting for the Messiah, and they had been waiting so long, with such intensity, that their waiting had become a way of life: prayer, fasting, continence, offerings. A whole civilization organized around a hope that kept not coming. Among these people, on the slopes of Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Elijah had heard the still small voice, lived an aged prophet named Archos. He had led the Essenes for 90 years, and in the cave of Elijah, where he prayed in his sacred vestments, he kept among his holy relics something extraordinary: Aaron's rod, the same rod that had once been kept in the Ark of the Covenant. Emmerich describes it kept inside a small ornamental tree, and when the prophet prayed over the marriage of one of the Blessed Virgin's ancestors, the rod would put forth a bud, a flower, a sign that this marriage, this union, was part of the chosen lineage. The ancestors of Mary had been tracked by heaven across the centuries. Every marriage, every child, every generation bringing the lineage one step closer to the moment it had been building toward. Mary's grandmother was a woman named Ismaria. After years of barrenness, after 18 years of waiting, she received a vision in the night, an angel beside her bed writing a letter on the wall. The letter M. Ismaria woke her husband and told him. He had seen it too, in his sleep. 3 months later, a daughter was born. They named her Anne. And Anne, quiet, simple, childlike Anne, the daughter who had not been expected, was the one marked with the sign. She grew up, as her mother had, with that strange intensity that characterized all the women of this lineage. She was taken to the school at the temple in Jerusalem at the age of 5, where she stayed for 12 years. When she returned home at 17, her mother was dying. Ismaria gathered her remaining strength and said to Anne what needed to be said. "You are a chosen vessel. You must marry, go to the prophet on Mount Horeb, and seek counsel." And Anne went. She found her husband in a man named Joachim. Emmerich describes him with her characteristic directness. He was far from handsome, short, thin, serious, but extraordinarily devout. A man who spent long hours alone in prayer in the fields, who divided his flocks into 3 portions, one for the temple, one for the poor, the worst third for himself. A man who gave everything and kept almost nothing. They married and settled near Nazareth, and for years, long years, they waited. Emmerich does not soften this. She shows us the neighbors watching with ill will, the reproaches, the whispered judgments, that unfruitfulness was a sign of hidden sin. The way Anne could barely appear in the synagogue without affront. Joachim going to Jerusalem to offer sacrifice, and there, in front of everyone, being publicly refused by a priest named Reuben, who thrust his offerings aside and sent him in disgrace to an enclosed alcove. This was the worst moment of his life. He was so ashamed that he did not even send word to Anne of where he had gone. She heard what had happened from strangers, and while he hid himself among his flocks on the distant slopes of Mount Hermon for 5 months, she remained at home, not knowing if he was alive or dead, weeping with her face to the earth. Then one evening, alone in the courtyard, Anne lit a lamp in the great tree that shaded her home. She knelt beneath its branches and cried out to God, not for herself, she said, but for Joachim, not for a child, just for her husband to come home. And an angel stepped down from the top of the tree and stood before her. He told her that her prayer had been heard, that Joachim was on his way to the temple even now, that they would meet at the Golden Gate, and that soon she would learn the name by which their child was to be called, and went back into her house. She prayed, she slept, and in the night she woke to find shining letters on the wall, golden red, large and few. The name was Mary. She gazed at the letters until daylight came, and they faded, and when she rose in the morning, Emmerich says, she looked as though she had grown young again. Mary was born with a sign on her body, the same sign that had been foretold. Emmerich describes her birth as an event felt far beyond the small house in Nazareth where it happened. In distant places, in Chaldea, in Egypt, devout people received intimations that something had shifted, that a soul had entered the world that was unlike any other. The souls in purgatory felt it. The angels knew. The child who arrived was not remarkable to look at, not in the way the world measures such things. She was a small, ordinary-looking infant. But there was something about her from the very beginning, a quality of recollection, of interior presence, that people noticed without being able to say exactly what it was. She was given the name Mary. When she was 3 years old, her parents dressed her in ceremonial clothes and brought her to Jerusalem, to the temple. The journey was solemn and deliberate, processional, attended by relations and friends, with prayers and offerings. They had been preparing for this for months. What happened when they arrived is one of the most extraordinary images in Emmerich's entire account. The steps leading up to the temple were steep, 15 of them, each one a significant climb for an adult, let alone a child of 3. The priests and Levites stood at the top, waiting. Anne and Joachim stood at the bottom. And Mary, this small child who had barely learned to walk steadily, climbed those 15 steps alone, without stumbling, without looking back, without fear. She went up as though she knew exactly where she was going, as though she had been waiting for this moment longer than her 3 years of life. At the top, the high priest took her by the hand and led her into the temple. And Emmerich says that when she entered the sanctuary, a shining presence came over her, a kind of illumination visible to those who were watching, that moved the priests themselves to awe. Anne and Joachim watched their daughter disappear into the temple. They turned and went home. They would not see her again for 9 years. Mary lived in the temple in a community of virgins, under the care of pious matrons. She had a small cell from which she could see into the sanctuary. She prayed for long hours. She embroidered vestments. She studied the scrolls. She cleaned the vessels used in the sacrifices. She lived with an intensity of interior life that set her apart even among the other dedicated girls, not in a way that made her proud, Emmerich notes, but in a way that made her entirely absorbed, as though prayer were not something she did, but something she was. When she was 14, the priests told her that it was time to leave the temple and be married. Mary wept. She had made a vow, she told them. She had given herself entirely to God. She did not wish to leave. She did not wish to be married. The priests told her it must be so. She went alone to her praying cell and cried out to God in the only way she knew, completely, without reservation. And at the fountain in the courtyard, drawing water, she heard a voice. Not an angel appearing in form, just a voice, comforting her, strengthening her, telling her that all would be as God willed, and that what God willed was not against what she had promised, but through it, she dried her tears. She consented. She did not know yet to whom. The priests knew they were looking for a husband unlike any ordinary man. They sent word throughout the land. All unmarried men of the line of David were to come to the temple. They arrived in festival garments. Emmerich says there were many of them, and each was given a branch of wood. They were told to inscribe their names on it, and to hold it in their hands during prayer and sacrifice. The one whose branch flowered would be the man destined by God to marry the maiden Mary of Nazareth. None of the branches flowered. The men went home, but the priests searched the ancestral tables and found something. There were 6 brothers registered at Bethlehem. One of them was missing, unknown. They made inquiries. They found him not far from Samaria, alone by a little stream, working at his carpentry for another man's workshop. He was not young. Emmerich suggests he was in his 30s. He had spent his adult life moving from town to town, learning his craft, avoiding women, praying for the coming of the Messiah with a fervor that his brothers had found strange and his parents had found disappointing. He was humble. He was solitary. He wanted nothing for himself. His name was Joseph. He came to Jerusalem dressed in his best. He held his branch of wood during the prayer and the sacrifice. And as he was about to lay it on the altar before the Holy of Holies, a white flower blossomed from the top of the branch, a lily, and above Joseph, Emmerich says, she saw appearance of light like the Holy Spirit. The priests brought him before Mary. She looked at this quiet carpenter, older than she had perhaps imagined, with the particular seriousness that characterized all the men of this lineage. She accepted him, not because she had been swept away by love in any ordinary sense, but because she recognized in the flowering staff the unmistakable language of God saying, "This one, this man." Their wedding was celebrated on Mount Zion and lasted 7 or 8 days. Emmerich describes Mary's wedding dress with a precision that takes your breath away. White woolen undergarments, wrapped at the arms, a robe of blue embroidered with roses in red and white and yellow, a scapular of white silk set with pearls, a crown of jewels, and her hair. She had very beautiful hair, Emmerich says, reddish gold, braided, and interwoven with white silk and pearls into a great net that fell over her shoulders. Old women who had attended the wedding, Emmerich records, were still talking about that dress decades later. After the wedding, Joseph went to Bethlehem to settle some affairs. Mary returned to Nazareth. They did not yet live together. This was the custom. And alone, in the quiet house in Nazareth, Mary waited. Emmerich is very precise about what happened next. It was not at the temple. It was not at a public fountain. It was in the small house in Nazareth, in the ordinary light of an ordinary afternoon, that the angel came. His name was Gabriel. Mary was sitting, working, when the room filled with a brightness that was not coming from any window. Gabriel stood before her, and he greeted her with words that no human being had ever received, words that named her as one already filled with grace, already beloved, already chosen above all others. She was troubled. Emmerich notes this carefully. She was not afraid exactly. She was troubled at the greeting. She was thinking about what it meant. She was a woman who had spent years in prayer. Visions and interior voices were not entirely unfamiliar to her, but this was different. This was something for which no amount of preparation was quite sufficient. Gabriel told her not to be afraid, He told her what was about to happen. He told her that she would conceive and bear a son, and that his name would be Jesus, and that of his kingdom there would be no end. And then, this is the moment that Emmerich says she found almost impossible to describe. There was a silence, not a long silence, but a real one. Gabriel waited, and Mary, in that silence, made the choice that all of human history had been building toward, not with excitement, not with terror, with the particular quality of recollection that had characterized her since she was 3 years old. Climbing those 15 steps alone, she said, "Be it done to me according to your word," and the world changed. We do not need to tell most of this chapter. You already know it, in the way that people know things they have carried for a long time without being able to say when they first learned them. The arrest, the trial, the road through Jerusalem, the hill outside the city. But Emmerich gives us something the Gospels do not linger on. She gives us where Mary stood, what she saw, what it did to her. Mary followed the road to Calvary. Every step, she had learned this road by heart, not on that day, over years, retracing it privately, measuring the distances, marking the stopping places. She knew every stone. She had knelt at every place where he had fallen. She had touched the wall he had leaned against. This was the road she had walked in prayer 1,000 times. Now she was walking it in the only way that would always be different from every time before. Emmerich describes her surrounded by a small group of holy women. She was supported. She could barely stand. Not because she was old, because what she was carrying in that moment was not a weight the body is built to carry. This was grief beyond grief, love beyond grief, something for which no human language has an adequate word. She saw him fall. She saw the soldiers strike him. She saw the crowds part before the procession and then close again behind it. And at one moment, Emmerich names the exact place, when she turned a corner and saw him for the first time that day, bowed under the weight of the cross. Their eyes met, and both of them, mother and son, almost collapsed. The women caught Mary. She did not cry out. She did not beg them to stop. She knew, with the same certainty that had carried her through the Annunciation and the flight into Egypt, and every other moment, when God's will had been beyond her understanding. She knew that this was not a mistake. This was the reason he had come. This was what all those quiet years in Nazareth had been in preparation for. But knowing something in your spirit does not stop your heart from breaking. At the place of crucifixion, she was close enough to hear everything. She did not look away. This was the last thing she could give him, her presence, her eyes, her refusal to abandon him at the moment when everyone else was doing exactly that. Emmerich says she stood at the foot of the cross until the end, that when he died, she neither fainted nor fled. She remained. And afterwards, when they took his body down, she held him one last time. This body she had once wrapped in swaddling clothes, in a stable in Bethlehem, and something passed from her that no mother should ever have to give. She lived. That is the extraordinary thing. After all of this, she lived. After the resurrection, after the ascension, after Pentecost, the early church was scattered by persecution. Lazarus and his sisters were set adrift on the sea. John the Apostle took Mary from Jerusalem, first to Bethany for 3 years, then to a small Christian settlement near the city of Ephesus, on the coast of what is now Turkey. Emmerich describes the place with the eye of someone who had been there. A hillside some 3.5 hours from Ephesus itself, wooded and solitary, where several Christian families had settled in caves and huts to escape the violence in Jerusalem. There was no city nearby, no marketplace, no crowds, just the sound of wind in the trees and a small stream that wound through the valley below. John had a house built for Mary before he brought her there. It was the only stone building in the settlement, small and divided into 2 rooms by the hearth in the center. At the back, behind a curtain, was her oratory, a small alcove with a cross that she and John had made themselves from different kinds of wood. At its foot lay a piece of parchment with words from her son, between two vases of fresh flowers. She lived here quietly with one maidservant. They ate very little. They prayed for long hours. Emmerich says that as Mary grew older, her face became paler and more transparent, not with illness, but with an increasing interiority. She was inhabiting this world less and less, not because she was abandoning it, but because something in her was being drawn, with increasing urgency, toward what lay on the other side of it. Behind the house, climbing the hill, she had built a way of the cross. She had paced out every distance herself, measured with the steps she had memorized over years in Jerusalem, walking that road in prayer after her son's death. Here, on this hillside far from Jerusalem, she had placed stones at every station. She had inscribed them herself in Hebrew letters. Every day, she walked it, not in memory of a dead man, in the presence of a living one. Emmerich says she never saw Mary grieve at these stones in the ordinary way of grief. She walked the way of the cross, the way the rest of us might walk towards someone we love, who is waiting for us, as if at the end of the path, he was there. Visitors came sometimes, apostles passing through on their journeys, stopping to rest, bringing news from Jerusalem, and from the communities forming across the Mediterranean world. John came and went, most often. He kept watch over her with the particular devotion of someone who has been given a gift beyond his deserving. Mary received them all with the same quality of stillness that had characterized her entire life. She asked questions. She listened. She remembered everything. And in those last years, Emmerich records, she was present at several gatherings of the apostles as a kind of living resource, not preaching, but there. The woman who had been at the beginning of everything, who had heard Gabriel's voice and carried God in her body, and stood beneath the cross, now sitting among the men who were building his church on her testimony. She had been young once. She had been ordinary once, as ordinary as any girl in Nazareth, who drew water from the well and learned her prayers from her mother. The years had not made her less herself. They had distilled her, as if the decades of prayer and loss and faithful presence had burned away everything that was not essential, leaving only what was real. And what was real, at the end, was love, pure and simple and overwhelming. She stopped eating, not from illness. She took tiny sips of liquid from a spoon her maidservant prepared, but food had become almost beside the point. She was consuming something that the body has no name for, and it was consuming her in return, slowly, gently, like a fire that does not destroy but transforms. When the time came, the apostles were called from everywhere in the world, not by letter, not by messenger, by vision, by inner summons, by that particular form of divine communication that does not come through the ears, but through the entire being at once, in Persia, in Spain, in the distant lands east of the Caspian Sea. Each of them, one by one, woke in the night knowing they had to go to Ephesus. They arrived exhausted and travel-worn. They embraced each other with tears. Then they went to Mary's room and received her blessing. She was lying on her narrow couch, wrapped entirely in white, her face pale and luminous. She could say only a few words to each of them, but she looked at each face, these men she had known since before they knew themselves, these fishermen and tax collectors and zealots who had been transformed by her son's presence, and she blessed them, with her hands crossed on their foreheads, with words she had been given for each of them specifically. Peter set up a small altar. They celebrated the sacrifice. In procession, solemnly, they brought her the last rites. She sat upright on her couch, without support, to receive communion. Then she sank back, and her gaze fixed upward, and she spoke no more. Emmerich describes what happened next with such care that you sense she is trying to give words to something but resists them. Ceiling of the room seemed to dissolve. A path of light opened from Mary's couch upward into what Emmerich could only call the heavenly Jerusalem. 2 great clouds of angels descended on either side, and Mary's body, still wrapped, still on the couch, rose, not dramatically, not violently, slowly, and with a kind of total serenity. It lifted off the narrow bed, and then her soul left it. Emmerich sees it as a figure of pure light, arms outstretched, and ascended along the path of light. The body sank back, still, glowing, arms crossed on the breast. Emmerich watched the soul rise. She saw it enter the heavenly Jerusalem and move toward the throne. She saw souls coming forward to meet it: Joachim, Anne, Joseph, Elizabeth, Zechariah, John the Baptist. She saw it pass through them all and reach the throne, where her son received her, where he placed in her hands a scepter. And then, this is the detail that stays with you, he gestured toward the earth, as if to say, your work here is not finished. Only your suffering is. The apostles buried her body in the cave at the end of her way of the cross. They planted a hedge of flowering shrubs across the entrance. They made the water from a nearby spring flow in front of it, so that no trace of the tomb could be found. 3 days later, Thomas arrived. He had been the farthest away. He had traveled the longest. He had not been there for her final hours. And Emmerich says he cried like a child when he heard what had happened. He asked to be taken to the tomb. He needed to see. John and the others went with him through the night. They pushed aside the hedge at the entrance. They bent low and entered the rock chamber. John carried a light. The coffin was where they had left it. The 3 gray bands still fastened around it. John undid them and opened the lid. The grave clothes were there, still wrapped, exactly as they had been placed. The cloth for the face folded back. The bindings for the arms slightly loosened. But the body was gone. They looked up, all of them, into the dark of the cave, and then up through the entrance toward the sky. They said nothing for a long time. What could they say? They had seen this before. They had stood in another garden, before another stone, on another morning. They had learned by then that the people God loves most have a way of not staying in the graves they are given. John folded the grave clothes. He carried them out carefully and brought them back to Mary's house, where her oratory still stood, the cross of different woods, the 2 vases with flowers that her maidservant had kept fresh. He placed the cloths on the little table before the cross, and the apostles stayed in Ephesus for several more days, planting flowers along her way of the cross, beautifying the garden before the empty tomb, praying, singing, working with their hands in the earth like devoted children, who had no other way left to express what they felt. Then they went out into the world to tell everyone what they had seen. 64 years. That is how long Emmerich says Mary lived. From the small house in Nazareth, where an angel once came through the light of an ordinary afternoon, to the stone house on a hillside near Ephesus, where the same light, finally, came to take her home. 64 years of faithful presence, of prayer in the dark, of love that did not demand to understand before it consented, of grief that did not break her, and joy that did not make her forget. Anne Catherine Emmerich never left her bed for the last years of her life. She bore wounds she had not asked for, and described visions she could barely find words for, and asked for privacy she was not granted. She died in 1824, having given everything she had, her suffering, her prayer, her extraordinary inner life, to whatever task God had assigned her. What she saw of Mary cannot be proven. The Church does not require you to believe it. But what she showed us is something the Gospels never quite had time to say, that Mary was not a symbol, and not a statue, and not a theological category. She was a person, a daughter of praying, hoping, grieving people who had been preparing for her for generations. A child who climbed 15 steps alone, a young woman who stood in silence before an angel and made the most important choice in human history, a mother who did not look away, an old woman who walked a hillside path every day, alone, toward a cross made of different woods, because she could not bear to live without some form of closeness to her son. She was, in every human sense, one of us, and in every sense that matters, she is still with us. If you are carrying something heavy right now, something you did not choose and cannot explain, let this speak to you. The woman who said yes to heaven knew what it meant to suffer. She did not pretend it was easy. She did not arrive at peace by avoiding the hard things. She arrived at peace by walking through every single one of them, with her eyes open and her heart intact. Thank you for watching. If something in this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories of the hidden face of God, subscribe to Vin the Dull Faith. We will keep looking.